Richard Montgomery drove his luxury car to the rundown apartment complex, determined to confront the tenant who hadn't paid rent in months. When a little girl invited him inside apartment 204, the wealthy landlord stepped through the door and stopped dead in his tracks. The makeshift fashion workshop he discovered wasn't just impressive. It belonged to someone from his past. Richard Montgomery's corner office overlooked the city skyline, a perfect view of the empire he had built over 2 decades. The real estate mogul settled into his leather chair, returning to a mountain of paperwork after 6 months away on international business. His assistant placed a fresh cup of coffee on his desk along with several files marked urgent. Richard thumbed through the stack, his expression darkening as he read a troubling report about a tenant in one of his lower-income properties. According to his property manager, the occupant of apartment 204 had fallen behind on rent for several consecutive months, despite multiple notices. He frowned, setting the report aside. His assistant raised an eyebrow when Richard announced he would address the situation himself. She suggested sending a representative instead, explaining that the neighborhood wasn't exactly suited for his taste or status. Richard dismissed her concern with a wave of his hand. He had built his fortune from nothing. He wasn't above visiting any of his properties. Richard checked the address again before climbing the concrete stairs to the 2nd floor. He located apartment 204 at the end of the corridor and rapped his knuckles firmly against the door. A moment passed before the door creaked open, revealing not an adult but a small girl no older than 10. Her clothes appeared worn but clean, and her bright, intelligent eyes looked up at Richard without a trace of intimidation. The child greeted him with surprising cheerfulness, explaining that her mother wasn't home yet but would return soon. She asked if he would like to wait inside, clearly unaware of who he was or why he might be there. Richard hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of entering a tenant's home without the adult resident present, especially when his purpose was to discuss overdue rent. Against his better judgment, Richard accepted the invitation and stepped across the threshold. What he saw inside made him stop in his tracks. The modest living room had been transformed into a makeshift workshop. Where one might expect to find a couch and television, there stood an industrial sewing machine that had seen better days. Makeshift clothing racks lined the walls, displaying dozens of garments that seemed oddly out of place in the humble apartment. Richard moved further into the room, momentarily forgetting his purpose. The designs hanging from the racks were sophisticated pieces created from what were clearly old, faded fabrics and repurposed materials. The walls themselves served as inspiration boards, covered with sketches and fabric swatches pinned in careful arrangements. In the center of this creative chaos, the little girl had returned to her task at the sewing machine, her small hands guiding expensive-looking fabric through the needle with remarkable precision. Richard watched in fascination as the child worked with the confidence and skill of someone with years of professional experience. Her movements were methodical and practiced, nothing like what one would expect from a child her age. The way she transformed these old, worn fabrics into something beautiful seemed almost magical. Forgetting momentarily why he had come, Richard approached one of the racks and examined a nearby garment that resembled an evening gown, though made from what appeared to be an old bedspread and curtain fabric. The silhouette and design sensibility could have walked a runway in Paris or Milan, despite being crafted from the humblest of materials. He asked the girl who had taught her such skills. Without looking up from her work, she explained proudly that her mother had shown her everything she knew. Richard stood dumbfounded. The sophisticated designs seemed impossible to have originated in this tiny apartment with its bare-bones equipment. The level of talent on display suggested formal training and professional experience, far beyond what he would expect from someone struggling to pay rent in one of his least expensive properties. Before he could fully process what he was seeing or ask more questions, the sound of keys jingling in the lock broke the moment. The apartment door swung open to reveal a woman in her late 30s, clutching several plastic grocery bags. She began to announce her return home to her daughter, using the child's name, Sophie. But the sentence died on her lips as she registered Richard's presence. The grocery bags slipped from her grip, their contents spilling across the worn linoleum floor. Richard turned toward the newcomer, prepared to introduce himself as her landlord. But the words never left his mouth. A shock of recognition hit him with physical force, as if someone had knocked the wind from his lungs. The woman standing before him, looking equally stunned, was not a stranger. Richard whispered her name in disbelief. Claire Wilson. Claire hadn't been just any woman from his past. She had been his closest friend during college, a fashion design student with extraordinary vision despite her humble background. But she was more than that. When banks had refused to fund his first real estate venture, Claire had believed in him enough to loan him money she had secured specifically to enter an important runway competition, her big chance to launch her fashion career. She had given up that opportunity, confident she could earn another slot with her talent, to help Richard when no one else would. That investment had been the cornerstone of what eventually became his real estate empire. And then, mysteriously, she had disappeared after graduation, without explanation, leaving Richard worried and confused. Claire recovered enough to send Sophie to her bedroom, promising they would order pizza later. The child looked between the adults with curiosity but obeyed, leaving Richard and Claire alone with 20 years of unspoken history hanging between them. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she explained what had happened after graduation. Just as she was about to launch her first small collection, she discovered her investor had stolen all her designs and money, leaving her with crushing debt and legal problems. Then came the discovery that she was pregnant. With her reputation in the industry tarnished by the investor's actions, Claire had made the painful decision to disappear and start over. Richard listened in stunned silence. The vibrant, ambitious woman he had known had endured hardships he could scarcely imagine, all while nurturing her daughter's obvious talent. When Claire apologized for the overdue rent, explaining that Sophie had needed emergency dental work that had depleted their savings, Richard waved away her words. That night, returning to his penthouse apartment, Richard couldn't shake the image of all he saw. He made discreet inquiries about youth fashion programs in the city, eventually discovering the Young Designers Program, an intensive course for gifted children that included materials, mentorship, and exhibition opportunities. When he returned to apartment 204, Claire opened the door with apprehension, clearly expecting eviction papers. Instead, Richard held enrollment papers for the Young Designers Program. 6 months later, Richard found himself seated in an auditorium for the program's showcase event. As the lights dimmed and the presentation began, he felt a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Sophie walked confidently onto the stage, beaming beside models wearing children's clothing made from recycled materials. Her creations, simple yet ingenious designs that incorporated sustainability without sacrificing style, had the audience murmuring in appreciation. Richard sat motionless as the program director announced that Sophie's sustainable fashion concept had been selected for feature in a national children's wear publication. Several industry professionals had already expressed interest in mentoring the young designer. As cameras flashed while Sophie accepted her award, Richard remembered that what had begun as a simple rent collection had unearthed not only a connection to his past, but a child prodigy whose talent would change a lot in the fashion world. Have you ever wondered how many hidden talents go undiscovered because of financial circumstances? What potential masterpieces might be waiting behind the doors of ordinary buildings in your own neighborhood?